who put the interest on subculture research. And well, Mr. Kevin, where are you?
I'm right here.
Okay, so so without taking a lot of my blabberish introduction, let's just welcome Kevin Dunn, and time and place is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Fakran. Thank you for the entire PSN Indonesia network and everyone for being here. I also want to thank William, Elise, and Jim. I had the unfortunate job of following 3 excellent presentations, but I'll do my best. I also want to acknowledge acknowledgement of country, as we've been doing. I'm here on land that was stolen from the Seneca peoples of the Haudenosaunee Federation, and a wound that can never be healed. I want to address specifically the themes of the conference. I think the focus on circuits, networks, and connections are really fascinating and tie directly into the kind of work that I do thinking about punk around the world. I want to start by my own positionality. Geographically, I'm here located in the United States in North America. I'm a white male with, a member of the global elite. I'm also in my 50s, so in generationally speaking, I'm actually older than punk. I can remember a time in the world before punk existed. So I've seen the evolution of punk over several decades. First got into punk in the early 1980s, playing in bands, booking shows, running a record label, putting out punk zines, all of which I still do today. But I'm also a scholar, so I want to position myself in my discipline. I'm trained as a political scientist. My work is very interdisciplinary, but I am saddled and informed by a number of the concepts, theories of my training, which is political science. Again, my own experience in getting into punk was in the early 1980s. So when we think about circuits, networks, and connections, back then, as punk was emerging in North America, the circuits were largely formed by individuals moving between scenes, either as individuals or as touring bands. The networks that were being formed were, of course, informal through independent labels, zines, independent record stores, music venues, a development of an informal infrastructure, DIY set of networks. I learned about punk from an independent record store a few miles from my house, and when the soul punk band of my hometown turned their practice space into an all-age venue, got to see bands like Black Flag and whoever was touring through at the time. Again, these networks were informal, and the connections that were being made were either direct face-to-face or indirect via the postal service. I remember filling out the catalog from, say, SST Records, trying to figure out which album I wanted, putting my well-concealed cash in there and sending it off. So that, again, indirect connections either through the postal service or very expensive long-distance phone calls. So the speed of movements as punk was emerging in the late 70s, 1980s, the speed of movement within these circuits, these networks, is usually as fast as humans could move, right? As fast as bands could travel, as fast as postal workers could deliver letters and packages. So that's what it looked like when I first started getting into punk. A few years ago, 3 decades after that, I had the wonderful experience to travel to Indonesia to visit the punk scenes in Jakarta and Bandung and Banda Aceh. And in some ways, I was performing some of the old practices. My backpack was full of American punk zines, CDs, and tapes that I would distribute across Indonesia. And then going home, my backpack was full of Indonesian punk zines, tapes, and CDs. But the thing that was very new was that I established the whole tour of the traveling around through the use of internet, right? So this is now the internet era, which has changed the way in which punk circuits, networks, and connections take place. It was still working with personal connections, calling up people and saying, hey, I'm a friend of so-and-so, can you hook me up when I'm coming through Banda Aceh or whatever. And a few of the people, Indra and others, happen to be here in this group right now. So I continue to be very thankful to you all. I do remember, though, I tell this story often, driving to the beach in Banda Aceh with a number of punks in a van, and we're listening to a number of cassettes, and we're all singing along to various punk songs, whether it was NoFX, Operation Ivy, I can't remember, Bad Religion, and having that shared cultural language, that ethos, that connectivity, that at that moment in time, recognizing that there was a global punk, right? That in the early 70s, sorry, late 70s and early 80s, where the feeling of small, discrete scenes were connecting to each other. Now we can actually talk very much about a global punk consciousness, as Jim just referenced. Now, my own intellectual interest is in the political and social work that punk is doing at the intersections of the global and the local. And of course, I'm using that shorthand. Punk doesn't actually have agency. I'm talking about punks and punk communities utilizing DIY punk ethos, DIY punk forms of independent production and so forth. The questions that I'm usually interested in thinking about, some of which have been talked about by my previous colleagues here. One of the questions is how DIY punk circuits, networks, and connections operate within global capitalism. I love Jim's reference there to Max Wood's, punk is a globalized culture of neoliberalism. I think that's totally fascinating. And I think Jim's right in terms of thinking about how nuanced that is, where we can see DIY punk in terms of acts of resistance, rebellion, and co-optation in ways that Elise was talking about in terms of activism. But I'm interested in how those DIY punk networks, those circuits and connections fit within a kind of global capitalism, because we're never outside of global capitalism in the 21st century. I think Hart and Negri are right. We are in empire, right? We are in a global capitalist world, and there's no outside of global capitalism. The second question I'm fascinated by is how DIY punk circuits, networks, and connections operate across this global landscape that's characterized by core periphery distinctions, right? And Jim was talking about the center, right? The reality is that people and products don't move across the globe in the same ways or with the same equal level of agency and freedom. That's our reality. I helped some American bands travel to Indonesia for tours. American bands, American cultural punk products can travel to and around Indonesia far easier than Indonesian bands and punk products like zines, CDs, and tapes can move to the United States and around the United States, even before COVID. Now, I do recognize that the complicated processes and manifestations of globalization often disrupt assumptions about core periphery distinctions there. At this point, given the way in which we produce, consume, and distribute punk and music in general, is very different, right? So an Indonesian band can record themselves fairly easily and post their song on YouTube or Bandcamp or other streaming services just as easily as I can with my crappy punk bands. So I recognize that things are changing, but I still find great value in the insights of within my discipline, what's referred to as world systems theory, the kind of Gramscian informed understandings of hegemony and structural inequalities, of which Jim was just referencing. I'm also interested, the third set of questions I usually focus on is interested in the process of cultural exchange. And again, Jim was referencing this as well, right? What anthropologists refer to as transculturation, right? How punks in one location draw from punk styles, forms, practices in other locations and adapt and adopt those styles and practices to address their own local context and issues. And I usually give the example that many of you probably know, the band Dunn, Celtic punk band Forgotten Generation, which is a great band, but it's kind of interesting that here a bunch of young band, well, they were young when they started out, punks in Indonesia are drawing from Celtic punk tradition, when of course Celtic punk is an American genre that cultural references and musical references, and how that kind of cultural transformation and transition goes to Dunn, where you've got these kids playing Celtic punk. I think that's super fascinating, and using Celtic punk and those kind of practices and those aesthetics to address their own local issues in their own local context there. So I'm interested in how people, and particularly how punks, are encultured, how they develop a sense of themselves as itself in relation to others, how they choose between and manufacture identity out of the cultural tools that they have at hand, such as global punk culture, but yet not determined solely by that same context that they in turn affect and help shape, right? How they shape and transform what we're referring to as global punk. I do believe DIY punk contributes in creating an environment that allows individuals and communities to shape their own identities and empowers them to make their own contribution to the world. I think that's true. I think that's more so for punk than for hip hop, just to take the beef that William is throwing out there. I'm kidding, I'm fine with that. But DIY punk in particular, I think, offers possibilities for self-empowerment, for resistance and rebellion in everyday life, right? Whether it's from the seemingly mundane personal politics of daily life to challenging the political order of ruling systems at the local or national level, to constructing disruptive alternative ways of being and acting within global capitalism. I sought to address a number of those questions and issues in the book that Fakhran just referred to, Global Punk. But for the rest of this talk, I want to talk about how some of those questions and issues are realized by focusing on one specific band. And this is the band Rebel Riot out of Myanmar, which probably many people here are probably familiar with, but perhaps not all. But how and why you're familiar with them, I think is going to be part of my discussion here. So just a little bit about Myanmar and about Rebel Riot. And I know I'm talking to people in Indonesia, you're familiar with Myanmar, right? It's close by. In fact, Cha Cha, who's the lead singer for Rebel Riot, we were recently talking, and he was talking about how there's, well, recognizing distinct differences between Burmese culture and Indonesian culture, recognizing a lot of similarities, especially within the punk scenes. Myanmar and Indonesia both traditionally are kind of closed conservative societies, both have a long experience with military rule. And Burma, what was Burma today, Myanmar, encountered a military coup in 1962, a long-running military dictatorship there. And as in Indonesia, punk gained a foothold in Myanmar in the 1990s. There were early bootleg tapes from US, UK scenes, the Sex Pistols, the Clash, Dead Kennedys, that were in circulation, but changes in the global music industry, and Jim kind of referenced this, and I can go into greater detail talking about some of the changes that were occurring within the music industry at the time. But those changes in the 1990s meant that there was a new wave of punk products coming, releases from Nirvana, Green Day, and Bad Religion that became more readily accessible, both in Indonesia, but also in Myanmar, though often continue to be spread via bootlegging. It was nothing like the growth of punk in Indonesia, right? But there was an emergence of a small Burmese punk scene in the 1990s. One of the standout bands was Ghost Rider, which was kind of Ramones influenced punk metal band that had a couple of cassette releases. I know them because there was a 7-inch split that they did with the Ants in 1998. That was put out on a French label, and the distribution was in Europe and North America. I'm lucky to have a copy of the 7-inch, but that 7-inch actually isn't available in Myanmar, which again, I'm thinking about that disconnect, the structural inequities in terms of circuits and networks of things moving here within global punk. It's kind of interesting. What happened is one of the members of the kind of very small Burmese punk scene, who notoriously was also a breakdancer, went to the UK and brought back, the story goes, he smuggled back a number of clothes, punk fashions that he'd picked up when he was in the UK, a copy of Melody Maker, which had an interview with Johnny Rotten, a number of punk zines and other music magazines. And when he got back to Yangon, he opened up a punk shop. And he started selling punk clothes, and he was actually making punk clothes there and preaching that DIY style of production. Cha-Cha, the lead singer of Rebel Riot, talks about how he would go and get jackets there, but the guy would give him the studs and says, you've got to put your own studs on your jacket, because this is DIY punk practice. Now, Cha-Cha in the 2004, he talks about how he's going to see a few of these punks walking around Yangon, which was then the capital. Talks about how initially he thought they were a gangster group, but it appealed to his non-conformity impulse in a kind of traditional society. At the time, he was listening to Linkin Park and Slipknot and some kind of American rock bands and a couple pop punk bands. But it's through the personal connections that he has with those local punks that he's going to start hanging out at that punk store. He's going to be flipping through those well-worn pages of Melody Maker, the other UK punk zines, and he's going to be learning about DIY punk through these imported goods, but also seeing DIY punk in practice right there in the punk shop, and talks about kind of the mentorship that he's going to experience there. And he decides that he's going to form a punk band. So I'm going to try and share my screen here real quick, because I do have some images that I want to share. So hopefully people can see that. So this is in 2004. This is the band as it's being formed here, and you can see they're drawing heavily from a UK 82 style. This is probably the most influential style. This is the defining style, the defining aesthetic of the Burmese punk scene at the time, and arguably still is. Cha-Cha in the conversations credits that initial contact, going and getting those products and the zines from Kenya, bringing them back to Burma. Really, what was being put forth within the Burmese scene was this kind of UK 82 style. He argues that because Myanmar was such a closed society, they weren't really aware of some of the global punk evolutions that were taking place outside Myanmar, except for the kind of limited influence that European D-beat and Japanese D-beat were having. But we're definitely drawing heavily from the UK 82 punk style. Again, this becomes the kind of dominant aesthetic here. What's going to happen is, I think, a major turning point, a number of turning points are significant, but one of the main points here is the 2007 Saffron Revolution. And this is when Buddhist monks are going to lead an anti-military uprising. And Cha-Cha talks about how he's going to go out, he's going to join these anti-military protests. And he'll admit that he actually doesn't know much about politics at the time. He just knows that he hates the military and he hates military rule. So he's going to be joining, and with some other punks joining these anti-military uprisings, and he's going to witness firsthand the violent repression that's going to take place when the military opens fire and starts killing protesters. He's going to actually witness the murder of protests by the military right in front of him. He talks about how he was scared, he was sad, and he was angry, but mostly he was angry. And initially he thought that there was no weapon that he had to fight back against this, until he realized that, well, he's got music, right? The music is their weapon. And that's really when Rebel Riot starts to cohere. They named the band Rebel Riot because, as they say, they're rebelling against bad systems. They're using punk as kind of venting their anger initially, right? Just he talks about just to shout our rage, to release our anger. And they're going to try and utilize those kind of DIY punk aesthetics, those punk practices to kind of give voice to their anger and their rage about what's happening around them. The 2007 Saffron Revolution, if you know, right, it's going to lead up to the 2010 disputed elections, and we'll see this process of political liberalization taking place. That punks are going to be involved in the democratization movement, but not to the extent that the DIY punk or the DIY metal scenes were involved, say, in the 1990s movements in Indonesia. We'll see the release of the Nobel Peace Prize winner and opposition leader Aung San Suu Kyi of the National League of Democracy, who's barred from running for office, but she's eventually going to be installed in a newly created position. It's kind of akin to a prime minister. And what occurs is the installation of a civilian military coalition government, but really it's a military government with some civilian veneers. At the time, rebel riots are going to continue to progress here. They're DIY to their core. When they're doing shows, they're usually secret shows under bridges, right? Here's a picture of them playing a show under a bridge in Yangon. And what they're doing at this time over these years is they're making connections locally, but also regionally and globally. In fact, it's going to be a German friend and fan who's going to fund their first tour to Indonesia. So they can go to Indonesia in 2013. I think they've gone to Indonesia 3 times over the course of the years. But that first tour in 2013, that's funded by a German friend and fan, that first tour is going to be transformative, right? They're doing the DIY circuit, they're playing and staying at squat houses and so forth. But it's actually their exposure to the local branch of Food Not Bombs, which is going to be transformative, because they're going to see that kind of form of DIY activism that Elise was referencing, that they find incredibly inspirational. And they kind of dedicate themselves to replicating that model they see in Indonesia around Food Not Bombs back in Myanmar. And what they do is they usually go drinking on Monday nights. And so what they decided to do is Monday night, that's when they're going to do their Food Not Bombs work, and the money that they were spending on alcohol and drinks, they're going to start funding their Food Not Bombs. And so on Mondays, starting in 2013, but continuing to this day, they cook and distribute food freely. There's a picture, and this is a recent picture because you can see they're masked up during the pandemic. They've been distributing food every week throughout the pandemic now for years. A few years later in 2015, they're going to start doing Books Not Bombs to focus on literacy and education for children. They're going to help set up a free medical clinic. They're becoming more of almost a collective, if you will, than a band. They'll create a shared communal space known as Common Street. And what they're doing is they're using their DIY punk skills for locally informed activism. They're making connections with garment workers, with sex workers, with IDP camp inhabitants, with members across the poor community. They're connecting with other civil society groups. They're building a community, right? To go back to Elise's conversation here. So locally, they're doing that. They're also becoming more engaged in human rights campaign. As many of you know, during these years, the Muslim minority community, the Rohingya in Myanmar, is facing violent repression, if not outright genocide, by the military and the military rulers with civilian trapping there. And rebel riots locally, nationally become really one of the more outspoken critics of what's going on, critiquing not just the practices of the military, but also the Buddhist apologists within their society and within their immediate community around this. In 2014, they released this album, Fuck Religious Rules, Wars. And they're also using not just their local and national, but they're also using global connections here to help advance their cause. In fact, a German documentary filmmaker will come to Myanmar to do a documentary about them. And some of you may know this. This might be how you actually know Rebel Riot through this documentary. It's released in 2015. My Buddha is Punk. There's Cha-Cha right there on the cover. It has global distribution in the United States. You can get it through Vimeo. It's subtitled in German, Spanish, Thai, English. I know there's bootleg copies in circulation in Myanmar. There's probably bootleg copies in circulation there in Indonesia. They're going to go and do other tours. They're going to go back to Indonesia a couple of times. They're going to go to the UK and Europe following, again, these informal networks. In fact, those tours are going to be crowdfunded using crowdsourcing funding to go through these networks. In 2017, they're going to go to the UK on tour. They're going to play with the Restarts and other UK street punk bands. And at the time, there's another documentary that's being filmed when they're traveling around. No spicy, no fun. The next line is more spicy, more fun. I haven't seen this film. It was just debuted last month in the UK on the 5th of November in the UK, and I'm hoping it will have a global distribution. The band is actually going to change a little bit after this. The female punk Hanin is going to join the band as a co-vocalist. And what they explicitly say is that they're trying to emulate that male-female vocals that are inspired by a German band, Pestpocken, if you know them. That's who they're trying to emulate, again, drawing from other punk traditions. And they're also, as Cha-Cha says, they're intentionally trying to situate themselves as a feminist band. When he saw My Buddha is Punk, he realized, oh my God, there's just a bunch of dudes here. We really have to walk the walk. We need to incorporate the women into not just the scene more actively, but also in the band, right? And put the women to the front. They're becoming, during these years, the face of Myanmar punk scenes. They're using their global connections via the internet, whether it's Facebook, Bandcamp, YouTube. And again, they're using local connections here with punks in other cities in Myanmar and across the region. But again, other civil society groups with their activism, right? Sometimes when we think about connections within punk, we're thinking about how one punk scene is connecting to another punk scene somewhere else. But what we're also seeing here is the way in which Rebel Riot is forming these connections and doing this community building with other groups, with other activist groups within Myanmar society. And they're using these informal personal connections and networks grounding in DIY punk ethos, which is going to become really important this year. Because in February 2021, we see the military coup in Myanmar. And that puts Rebel Riot very much literally on the front lines of fighting back against the military coup, using their DIY activism to help organize and lead protest. They're organizing street protests and acts of resistance. Common Street, their communal shared space with printing presses and screen printing, has been raided numerous times by security forces, with the correct assumption that they're using those tools to print and promote anti-military tracts, but with the incorrect assumption that they're part of the PDF, the People's Defense Force. They'll point to their instruments and go, no, look, we're just a band. They're not just a band. And of course, bands can be dangerous in the hands of the right people. What they're doing is they're utilizing local connections, their networks, their circuits that they've constructed locally over the years for local-based activism against the military rule here. There we go. They're also at the same time leveraging their global connections, their global networks and circuits to raise money and awareness of the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar today. Some of you may know Rebel Riot because of their activism, because of the ways in which they're engaging in this to really promote awareness of what's happening in Myanmar. And they're utilizing these global DIY punk connections and networks, from Henry Rollins, formerly of Black Flag, speaking about Rebel Riot in their cause in Myanmar on multiple platforms, including interviews on Al Jazeera, members of Anti-Flag interviewing Rebel Riot on the Hope Dies Last podcast. The band using Facebook, YouTube, and social media to bring awareness about what's happening in Myanmar, not just to the global punk community, but also to the larger global community. It's really fascinating how the commercial Western media is enamored by seeing what seems like a novelty to them of punks at the forefront of a pro-democracy movement in Myanmar. So Burmese punks, especially Rebel Riot, are showing up in mainstream Western press, which I find interesting. Currently, the band actually can't play. They're facing active repression. They can't go out at night. There is a military curfew, but they're also very recognizable on the streets of Yangon by the security forces. This is the lesson of Black Bloc anarchist punks in Europe learned years ago. Don't dress and look in ways that are easily identifiable by security forces. As you can see, they're easily identifiable. And so they become targets within Myanmar from the security forces. I'm going to end by making the bold claim that Rebel Riot is probably one of the most important DIY punk bands in the world today because of the ways in which they're utilizing, they're leveraging, and they're building these circuits, these networks, and these connections. And so what I want to do, I'm going to switch this over, is because we haven't had any music yet on this panel, which is just ridiculous, right? I want to share the video of their song here from their newest album released during the military rule. It's called, it's a title track called One Day. So I'm just going to share this with you here. All right. Thank you very much. I appreciate being able to be here. I look forward to everyone's comments and questions. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks so much, Kevin, for the